Again, welcome everyone. This is actually the second in our seminar series for the spring of 2021. I want to remind you all to put questions that you might have for our speaker in the Q&A, and I'm going to hold them till the end for this talk, but feel free to type them in at any time. I'm really excited today to introduce Jessica Symes. Is it Symes or Sims? Symes, yes, correct. Symes, she's an assistant professor of sociology at Boston University, and she's going to be talking to us about mass incarceration. Jessica said she'll take questions at the end, but again, type them into the Q&A, and I will either unmute you or go ahead and read those questions to her when she's done with her presentation. And I'm very excited because she told me she's good with data visualization. So we have a lot of pretty pictures and graphs to look at during this talk. And I'll hand it over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's such an honor to be here today. Such a huge fan of the work coming out of this program. Very, very excited to share some of the work I've been doing. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully that worked out. And just let me know if there are any sort of challenges in terms of hearing or seeing my slides.
I will. They look great for now. So
okay,
good to
great.
go.
So I'm going to be sharing today research that comes from my book, which is forthcoming this year, and it provides a spatial analysis of mass incarceration in the United States, and I really look forward to your questions and comments. So in the late 20th century, the United States embarked on an experiment in crime control policy that was just globally and historically unprecedented. After several years of stability, decades of stability, really, in the early 20th century, up to 1970, the rate of imprisonment more than quadrupled. And by 2012, the incarceration rate, which includes both prison and jail, was about 700 per 100,000, with a total of 2.23 million people in custody. So today, about 1 in 3 adults have a felony record, and demographers think this is about between 70 and 100 million people. And nearly 1 in every 100 adults currently resides in prison or jail. Today, the United States incarcerates more people than any other nation in the world. When compared to other nations, the United States incarceration rate is about 5 to 10 times higher than rates in other liberal democracies in Western European countries. So in addition to this scale, racial disparities are a defining characteristic of the American system of punishment. So of the over 2 million people behind bars, 60% are people of color. And for African-American men born in the late 1970s, for African-American men born in the late 1970s, the lifetime risk is 1 in 3. And for those who dropped out of high school, 70% will have prison records and are more likely to be incarcerated than employed in the labor market. So these two facets of the prison system, the racial disparity and the scale, has led to what scholars term mass imprisonment. And so David Garland has this definition where imprisonment ceases to be the incarceration of individual offenders and becomes the systematic imprisonment of whole groups of people in the population. Some might call this a population dynamic. So I'm here today to discuss why I think a spatial analysis is really vital for understanding specifically racial disparities and also the community level conditions and effects of mass incarceration. Mass imprisonment is a really historically new and significant aspect of cities and poor communities all across the United States. And policing and court processing and even community supervision, what happens to people when they come out of prison and are on probation or parole, those are all organized by an intense pattern of geography. We also know from this massive literature on place stratification that life chances are highly spatially organized by a pattern of race and socioeconomic status in places. And the spatial concentration of punishment, in turn, might reproduce these conditions of racialized communities. So I'm going to start to define what I mean by sort of a spatial context of mass incarceration. What I simply mean is the spatial concentration of the prior residences of people who end up incarcerated. So today I'm going to argue that I think mass incarceration should be conceptualized as one of the legacies of extreme racial residential segregation. That racial disparities in imprisonment could be usefully conceptualized as resulting from cumulative racialized disadvantage, beginning with the structure of communities and neighborhoods prior to criminal justice processing and incarceration. So my book looks at sort of what are the implications of looking at mass incarceration from a spatial perspective down into neighborhoods and communities, and not just at the state level or the national level. And I think a spatial perspective has several important implications for understanding mass incarceration in new ways. So the first is a spatial perspective tells us that sort of taking a very broad and demographic approach and not analyzing a single city, I find that mass incarceration affects communities very broadly. And in particular, currently the highest rates of prison and jail incarceration rates are found in non-metropolitan counties, small cities, and suburbs and rural areas. Second, even by taking a very broad spatial approach to this data, I find that communities of pervasive incarceration remain, despite this sort of very broad condition of the prison system, where incarceration has become an important dynamic in neighborhoods, especially low-income and impoverished and hyper-segregated neighborhoods. And this is also part of the dynamic, as I mentioned earlier, about the spatially concentrated pattern of arrest, arraignment, sentencing, and incarceration. So a spatial analysis also reveals really significant implications for the promise of American public policy to ameliorate the harms and effects of mass incarceration. So I think there are really important social and political conditions of mass incarceration that come from an analysis of mass incarceration as a community level condition. So I'm going to focus today on these two parts of my book that really focus on understanding racial disparity and understanding sort of the larger, broader effects of mass incarceration for communities. So in what follows, I am going to provide just a brief background and justification for the study location and detail the theoretical framework that motivates these analyses and discuss the data collection. Then I'm going to share key findings from my book, and I'll conclude with a summary of this work's contribution to theory and public policy. So for the next few minutes, I'm just going to share very briefly about the main research site of Massachusetts to provide background on the broader motivation for this work. So I had the wonderful opportunity of meeting with graduate students today, and I talked to them all about this project as a sort of a data project, really first and foremost. And when I was a graduate student, I answered a job posting for an unpaid internship at the Massachusetts Department of Correction. This is actually a photo I took on my walk back to the train station. And I'm often asked how I got access to geographic data at this level of specificity. And I think it really came from developing a very long-term partnership with the research division of the prison system. And so I would drive or take the train and work at this very large sort of Victorian, I think, house that sat right outside Concord Prison, which is one of the oldest prisons in the country. So Massachusetts is an interesting place to study criminal justice policy. So like much of the rest of the country, Massachusetts enacted a series of tough on crime policies, including truth in sentencing, mandatory minimums, and 3 strikes. In 2018, Massachusetts voters overwhelmingly supported a bill to decriminalize cannabis, and the state legislature passed comprehensive criminal justice reform, which brought significant change to juvenile justice, bail reform, increased funding for diversion programs, alternatives to incarceration, even solitary confinement, the elimination of mandatory minimums for certain low-level drug offenses. So because I'm in Wisconsin, at least virtually, I thought I'd pull some data from your state as well for this slide. So despite these punitive policies, Massachusetts actually has the actual lowest rate of incarceration in the country. So out of 50 states, they're the 50th. Wisconsin, like other Midwestern states, has an incarceration rate that's near the national average. But of course, again, in global perspective, Massachusetts has an incarceration rate that is markedly above the historical and comparative norm for societies of this type. So Massachusetts loves to compare itself to Western Europe and Scandinavian countries for its, educational institutions and achievement among especially K through 12, but we really are not anywhere near where those countries are. Somewhere between, 2 to 3 times higher incarceration rate than those countries. So Massachusetts racial disparities, though, are on the other end of the spectrum in terms of minority versus white incarceration. And this is actually true for Wisconsin as well. So Massachusetts has a very high Black to white ratio in incarceration rates, and actually has the dubious honor of having the second highest Latino white ratio of incarceration in the country. So Massachusetts ratio for Latino incarceration is 3 times the national average. Wisconsin, though, has the second highest Black-white ratio incarceration rate, Black-white ratio of incarceration in the country. So it's higher than Massachusetts, has a lower Latino white incarceration rate. So in all 50 states, Massachusetts has the highest Latino white incarceration ratio. Wisconsin has the second highest Black-white ratio in incarceration. I think what's interesting, though, just to wrap up the background a bit, is this case of very low incarceration overall, but very high disparities offers a really important window into the challenges of addressing social inequality, even in the context of a progressive state with a comparably robust and high quality welfare, healthcare, and educational system. Massachusetts is in some ways a best case scenario from a public sort of social service environment. And yet has these really, really profound disparities. So how I'm approaching this theoretically, so sociologists beginning with W.E.B. Du Bois have long explored the racial spatial divide in harmful community exposures and the fundamentally different social environments that white and Black and Latino people occupy. And William Julius Wilson famously wrote in The Truly Disadvantaged about the conditions of poverty, specifically saying that simple comparisons between poor whites and poor Blacks would be confounded with the fact that poor whites reside in areas which are ecologically and economically very different from poor Blacks. Then about 23 years later, Ruth Peterson and Lauren Crevo wrote Divergent Social Worlds, where they were really trying to understand the exposure to criminalized violence in white and Black communities. And their finding was actually also this sort of methodological problem. They wrote about the challenges of comparing white and Black community level exposures to violence, stating, in this racialized reality, whites, African Americans, and Latinos, and others are highly segregated from one another in settings where social and economic circumstances are rarely comparable. So this really poses a challenge, a methodological challenge about what are the relevant comparison groups with this sort of level of confounding in the very nature in which communities are organized in American society. And so for these scholars and for many others, of course, durable disadvantages in place structure observed racial differences in poverty and crime. But to date, incarceration rates have rarely been conceptualized in this way. So in fact, the research on punishment has really focused and favored explanations of disparities as resulting from either sort of national or state level policy relating to welfare or crime policy, or racial bias and discrimination in individual decision making. So sort of very briefly, made famous by Michelle Alexander's capacious book, The New Jim Crow, people argue sort of at this macro level, macro historical level, that racial disparity follows from this long line of historical conditions of racial caste. that punitive policies and welfare retrenchment, and in particular the war on drugs, heaped the harshest penalties on the most vulnerable populations. So these are sort of the macro level explanations that have led scholars to sort of analyze racial disparity in the prison system. Another sort of avenue and really large research sort of program is trying to understand all of the very important and critical encounters that individuals have in the criminal justice system, from the decision to stop and search, to arrest, to charge, to end up, with conviction, sentencing, and then what happens to people when they're in prison. That racial disparity follows from discrimination and bias and racism that emerge at discretionary stages of the criminal justice system. So what happens when an officer decides to arrest someone, a prosecutor decides to engage in certain court decisions, what are the ways that these individuals end up producing bias at each stage? So I think that the spatial context is really important above and beyond individual level bias or even punitive criminal justice policy. And I think that we have to understand how the spatial organization of residence and criminal justice activity is really driving a lot of the disparity that we see in the incarceration outcomes that I referenced at the very beginning of this talk. So I'm arguing that racialization is this master mechanism that produces both residential segregation and a broad array of punitive racial projects that are aimed at marginalized communities. And so there are sort of these two problems. One is that a national focus at the aggregate has obscured how a very small number of places actually contribute the lion's share of incarcerated populations. And so my intervention here is by incorporating a spatial analysis, I'm providing insight into how criminal justice policies are enacted across and within communities and into the severity of racial inequality that's existing kind of prior to somebody encountering the criminal justice system. And then studies of racial bias in decisions made by line officers or prosecutors or sentencing judges often find little evidence of racial disparity, leading to sort of the erroneous conclusion that racial bias is not a fundamental feature of the US criminal justice system. And so I think that this is often because we're studying a single point in the process and that we fail to sort of really take seriously the contextual and sort of cumulative quality that racial disparity has across these different stages of the criminal justice process, and beginning with what kinds of neighborhoods are policed and in sort of known by court actors or community supervision officers to sort of have these sorts of problems that they must sort of govern and surveil. So I define this term in my book, communities of pervasive incarceration. A community of pervasive incarceration is one where incarceration has become a fundamental dynamic due to an extreme level of spatial concentration of prison admissions. And I formalize this sort of using different measures of spatial concentration. Sometimes I use just rates within looking at different quantiles of rates. Sometimes I use spatial measures like Moran's eye. And I think that the main argument here is that racialized neighborhood patterns are producing these communities of pervasive incarceration, where incarceration has become a facet of community life. And neighborhoods with a very distinct composition are vulnerable to the greatest surveillance and harshest treatment by criminal justice authorities. So how do I get to this argument? Just to walk you through a little bit of data. So one of the things that really inspired this project was actually a group of incarcerated men in a prison in New York State. started to collect their own geographic data. They noted that a lot of the people who were coming to prison were from just 7 neighborhoods in New York City. And this sort of intuition that we should understand the communities that are losing people to the prison system, and that those communities matter to incarcerated people, was really a huge influence for my work, looking sort of more broadly at the spatial context. Prison systems collect address data when somebody comes through, sort of as a new admission to the prison, and they record what's called the last known address. And that's the data that I use to sort of analyze the pre-prison neighborhood environments. And so these intake records have the last known address and also a lot of really interesting information relating to the person's race, gender, age, marital status, etc. And I aggregate these addresses to census tracts and cities and counties to do some analysis. And I merged that data. For the work I'm presenting in this first part of my findings, I focus on a prison admissions cohort between 2009 and 2017, which amounts to 21,000 unique prison admissions, or about 6 prison admissions a day. For this analysis, I'm using American Community Survey data at the census tract level. I also use data from a variety of sources, but for time's sake, I'm not going to go too deep in the crime data, but I have census tract level crime data and arrest data. And then I use census tracts and research on studying the relationship between racial composition and crime, and prior studies find this scale to be really meaningful. For some of the work in this presentation, I'm also going to be using a data set from the Vera Institute of Justice Incarceration Trends data set, which is an annual county level prison admission data for US counties. So getting into some of my first findings. So first, I just want to take you sort of through a set of communities of pervasive incarceration throughout the state. And one of the big findings here for me is that to account for sort of the experience of communities of pervasive incarceration, one must look outside of the largest city in the largest urban communities. So the first here is, so what I'm showing in the next few slides are a set of maps that I'm mapping this address level data onto the same geography, but breaking up the data by Latino, Black, and white. So in this case, you can sort of see that this concentration for Black incarcerated people is very, very intensified in the and centered on the neighborhoods, the sort of historically Black neighborhoods of Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan in Boston. And we can see, like, even though throughout this whole region, there are very, very intense pockets of white communities, very, very, majority white communities, there's almost no sort of real suggestion of a concentration for white incarcerated people. For Latinos, a bit less concentrated. So next is a city called Springfield for basketball fans. It's where the Basketball Hall of Fame is located. And it's also where, sort of Springfield and its suburb Holyoke, it's part of Western Massachusetts. It just sits north of the Connecticut border, which is this dotted line here. This was the site of Tim Black's book, When a Heart Turns Rock Solid. And he describes in this book sort of the effects of loss of manufacturing and the sort of characteristic of these cities in Massachusetts and sort of the racial tensions that emerged as new populations started to move in. Holyoke, which is where you see the concentration up north, is a small suburb of Springfield. It was once called the Paper City. It had a very robust paper production sort of manufacturing industry. All saw the closure of it and was actually a major reception center for Puerto Rican survivors of Hurricane Maria. So very, very large Latino community in Holyoke today. Next, we're moving over to Lowell and Lawrence. Again, you sort of see these intense concentrations of incarceration, in this case for Latinos. So Lawrence, which is the sort of community of concentrated incarceration on the left, again, was a very sort of thriving textile industry that completely collapsed, and was actually written about in the New York Times Magazine called the City of the Damned. And Boston Magazine called it the most godforsaken place in Massachusetts. So why is that? Very, very high levels of unemployment and poverty and violence in this community. And even in a city that is over 3/4 Latino, they only recently elected their first Latino mayor. And it's sort of another sort of town that was once a sort of thriving white community and became a new destination for low-income people of color, and sort of now have very, very high incarceration rates. So I mentioned that you don't really see white concentrations. Despite white concentrated population, you don't really see white concentrated incarceration. And Fall River is another small town sort of on the Rhode Island border that is an exception, actually. So Fall River is one exception to this concentration. You can sort of see that Fall River has actually very, very high rates of incarceration among white men. It's been known and written about in national news about having some of the highest rates of opioid-related deaths in the country. In a city with about 90,000 people, 64 people died in an overdose. And so for comparison, Boston has 685,000 people and had 195 deaths. So very, very high level of opioid related death. Also, violent crime in this town is the second highest for municipalities in the state. So just wanting to draw in these small cities into our thinking around mass incarceration, and also sort of the long-term effects of deindustrialization. I think the sociological literature in particular is focused heavily on big cities and their rise and fall in manufacturing, and not really looked at these smaller cities. So to sum up, though, in terms of both absolute numbers and rates, small cities and suburbs have the highest rates of incarceration in the sample. So I'm going to now sort of move on from looking just sort of descriptively at maps and start to dig into the neighborhood level data and looking at sort of this question and this sort of methodological puzzle that William Julius Wilson and Peterson and Crevo were kind of dealing with. And one of the things that Wilson says is that white people occupy a very unique niche, even those who are living in poverty, who are exposed to violence, or perhaps incarcerated. And so I wanted to kind of replicate that. And this is actually a replication of a graph that Bill Wilson created in his book. And so one of the things I find here is that so this is a graphic of people who went into prison and whether or not they lived prior to incarceration in a place that had very low admission rates, moderate, high, or very extremely high rates. And so what I find is that even for white people who go into the prison system, nearly half of them are living in a low admission rate, like sort of quantile for the sample. So very large number of them are living in environments where incarceration is not pervasive. On the other hand, 11 and 13% of Latino and Black people are living in that kind of environment prior to incarceration. So then I look at sort of the top 5% of incarceration rates in the data at the neighborhood level. And I ask, okay, well, how many white people are living in these places where there's like they're at the top 5 percentile of admissions, and only 5% of them are living in those environments. However, nearly a quarter of non-Hispanic, Black, and Latino prison admissions come from the very highest, the 95th percentile of prison admissions in the data. So I'm starting to see already here that its comparison groups are going to be really challenging, because even for folks who are extremely disadvantaged or going into state prison, there's a huge racial divide in what those neighborhood environments are like from a prison perspective prior to going in. So now I want to just look at Black, white, and Latino neighborhoods. And here I'm kind of using a pretty coarse measure of neighborhood racial composition. So neighborhoods that are at least 50%, greater than 50% Black, greater than 50% Latino. And because there are so many greater than 50% white communities in Massachusetts, I break it up again, just looking at the top 10% and then 50 to 90. Ooh, sorry. So what I find here is the median prison admission rate of white neighborhoods is about 1/3 the minimum for Black neighborhoods. Only outliers in white neighborhoods track the distribution of prison admissions in Latino and Black neighborhoods. In this environment, Black neighborhoods saw a minimum of 20 prison admissions during this admissions cohort period. So no Black neighborhoods had less than 20. In one neighborhood, there was 121 prison admissions during this time period. However, 71 white neighborhoods saw 0 prison admissions for the 9-year period. So not a single person was recorded having lived in those neighborhoods prior and then went to prison between 2009 and 2017. So I'm starting to see that there is this profound racial spatial divide in prison admissions. And I want to sort of get at a measure of disproportionality, a very, very simple measure. The percentage of people in a particular racial group at a particular event, for example, imprisonment, as a ratio to the percentage of that racial group in the overall population. So if we have a 1, that means it's proportional to its population share. If 50% of the people going to prison are from that group and they actually only account for 10% of the population, we would call that overrepresentation. And then, of course, if 10% of the incarcerated population is from this county, but they account for 50%, that would be underrepresentation. Very, very simple fraction. So, we could say a ratio of 1 indicates a system that imprisons people perhaps independently of race. So here, I'm going to plot the level of disproportionality among Black population against white population in neighborhoods. So what is the level of disproportionality among the Black and white population within each neighborhood? So what I find is the 90th percentile for Black disproportionality is nearly 30 times the 90th percentile for whites. Disproportionality is the fundamental reality for Black and Latino neighborhoods. So this is what it looks like for Latinos. So white disproportionality is this just sort of, it's the fundamental reality. The median for Black prison admissions is 14, which is 12 times the 90th percentile for whites. And these results suggest that, at least in the case of imprisonment, research on racial disparity should employ local measures to avoid sort of underestimating racial inequality at the community level. So if I were to do this exact same measurement at the state level, Black disproportionality is 2.9 and Latino disproportionality is 2.7. So how does this look at the national level? So I explore this exact same simple fraction, not controlling for anything, just looking at racial disparity, racial disproportionality, I should say. And I explore this for a national sample of US counties. And here's the distribution. And I'm just gonna zoom in a little bit because there's so many outliers for Black population that it makes it really hard to read this graph. So these graphs are a bit startling. And I've looked at this data also broken out by region and by urbanicity. And I can say on average, and accepting outliers, White populations are essentially never overrepresented in prison populations, and Black populations are never underrepresented in prison admissions. So on average, in the data, in the VERA data, in the US county level data, there are only 3 counties in the whole US out of over 3,000 counties where white imprisonment is overrepresented in relation to its white population by a factor of 2. So that means that there are 2 times the percentage of people who are going to prison that are white as their presence in the county. I find 80 counties where Latinos are imprisoned 2 times or more their population share. And for Black population, there are over 1,200 counties where imprisonment among Black Americans is 2 times their population share. So conceptualizing incarceration as this sort of community level environmental condition has several implications for sort of how we make sense of this from a policy standpoint and also how incarceration, if we really take David Garland's definition to heart, what it means to imprison whole groups of people and conceptualizing that and taking that. And so one of the ways that I do this in my book is I try to develop measures that actually try to take seriously some of the normative commitments that we might have, such as, democratic membership in American society, maybe the normative commitment of, political participation, or that we think people should be part of a family as a social unit, those types of things. And so one of the ways I'm trying to sort of think about mass incarceration differently is not just the total number of people who left, but sort of how we can conceptualize this as loss. So other scholars have certainly tried to do this. Becky Pettit and Bruce Western have looked at how this loss actually creates, a really distorted view of of our statistical portraits of American social inequality. Other scholars have looked at how this, exclusion from political institutions has really affected all sorts of policy decisions at the state and federal level. And also, scholars have looked at how public investments in criminal justice and prisons significantly resulted in the loss to civic infrastructure and other sort of potential programs. And, last summer, calls for defunding the police was really fundamentally, I think, about why are budgets so heavily focused on criminal justice, and how can we think about reusing this money in different ways? So I'm defining this conceptually as chronic and long-term exposure to loss due to incarceration. And I formalize this sort of similarly to public health scholars, thinking about it sort of as potential years lost, like measures of premature death. And I sum this across a geographic area. So, and sort of from a theoretical perspective, I'm thinking about how loss to losing someone to state prison. So people on average in the Massachusetts state prison system are gone for about 5 years on average. This idea between loss and stress. So when you lose someone to a prison system, you might be in touch with them, but they're fundamentally not with you, and it can create stressors, can affect your economic well-being as you lose that sort of source of income and support in the household, not to mention all of the emotional and familial effects that can have. So I also think that, as my data has shown prior, a group's vulnerability to loss really depends on geography. So what I do is I sort of add up all the years that those people were sentenced to. And in particular, I'm looking in this data set from 1997, I want to say, to 2008. And that's because these are the years where mass incarceration peaked in Massachusetts. I find that, there's a huge amount of loss. It's kind of unfathomable. So Massachusetts sentenced people to a minimum of 127,000 years between 1997 and 2009. This is like multiple ice ages. This is like the lowest incarceration rate state in the country. Boston alone lost 487 years for every 10,000 residents, for a total of 29,000 years. So the city, those of us who study the social structure of cities, what does that mean for, the labor market, for families, for the structure of communities? Small cities, are losing 600 to 1,000 years for every 10,000 residents. And just 8 cities, including Boston, covering about 20% of the state population, accounts for over 57% of the community loss that was experienced. This is also, when you drill down to neighborhoods, very much racialized. There's a neighborhood that is, over 45, maybe over 50% Latino, that lost actually 1,000 years. Just that neighborhood lost 1,000 years to the prison system. And so tying it back to earlier, Black and Latino neighborhoods experience the greatest levels of loss, and neighborhoods with no loss at all are at least 53% white, and on average are about 82% white. So just to summarize, incarceration and imprisonment specifically is just fundamentally, at its core, definitionally segregative. It changes the composition and membership of communities and neighborhoods. It interrupts community bonds and connections to place. And community loss is a way to reframe community level impacts of incarceration, moving away from sort of the ways that, rates of incarceration, especially by rates, can blame individuals and communities. And so there's this sort of reframing of this process away from just the system itself to sort of what is the overall human cost. So I'm going to just wrap up, and then I'm really excited for your questions and comments. In sum, I'm arguing that racial segregation underlies the demographic concentration of punishment, though I believe this is rarely theorized or studied as an important driver of racial disparity in incarceration. I know that Monica Bell, who I know quite well, is coming next week, and she'll be talking to you about how criminal justice might actually be reinforcing segregation. So it could be that not only is segregation driving a lot of what we see in the prison population, but that practices of policing are sort of reinforcing and reinforcing segregation in communities. Mass incarceration affected a really broad set of communities, not just large cities. And I really hope that more and more we start to analyze mass incarceration as a broad mode of governance affecting all sorts of communities beyond just the inner city of large cities. And finally, mass imprisonment will have long-term effects on the quality of membership in American society and also the health of communities. And even as prison admissions decline in some places, we're going to see these long-term effects. I think my empirical contributions can be summarized as that national and state level measures obscure the lived experience of mass incarceration as one that's fundamentally shaped by community and the spatial character of criminal justice contact. It's important to have granularity and a broad approach. So not just having aggregate data across all 50 states, having a lot of data at a very small level of geographic aggregation. And we should explore measures that examine the cost of mass incarceration, not just to civic infrastructure, like the $1 Million Blocks project, which shows how much of the prison budget is being spent in a particular community, but also the cost to sort of the health of communities more broadly. And I think, and this is maybe a challenge, but I think we can actually measure and test our normative commitments if we're very explicit about what those are. So from a policy perspective, I think racial disparities should be conceptualized as cumulative and contextual, But most of the policy reform has focused on individual level interventions to reduce bias among system actors, like bias training or diversifying police departments or DA's offices, things like this. And I think eliminating the bias of individual actors might have very little impact on the overall disparities in the system. And at the same time, sort of more big structural change, so to speak, is very hard to articulate, let alone get public support for. So how do we develop place-conscious policies that really can affect the process of criminal justice? I think also in the reform conversation, we need to bring in small cities to those conversations, because a lot of the reform and declines in prison are very spatially concentrated in our largest cities. A spatial perspective, I think, offers a lot of opportunity for understanding this growth or sort of not lack of decarceration in some areas and not others. A lot of my next work is going to be sort of thinking about incarceration as a social determinant of health and a community health burden, and how incarceration might be reproducing segregation and disparities in health. And I have a couple of projects looking at how incarceration health burdens can be measured at the community level. That's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And your graphics did not disappoint, so good to see you. I want to ask folks to take a moment and type in any questions they have or comments into the Q&A. And I'll just start with a softball. As a non-criminologist, can you talk me through how to think about the overlap of geographic areas and then like jurisdictions? Just because that's right. Like I was struggling, like how do I think about those boundaries? Either from, police are municipal, right? And or courts and that kind of stuff.
Yes, I think this is actually a really, really important question. So a lot of the work that I had seen looking at sort of local levels of incarceration at the neighborhood, like sort of looking at neighborhoods, had focused on a single city. But the vast majority of people who are in prison are in state prisons. Okay. And so Massachusetts is governed by, the Massachusetts prison system is governed by a state jurisdiction. The courts are governed by a district and a county. There's usually an elected county sheriff who will run a jail system. Most of the time, vast majority of the time, police are run by municipality. And so a lot of my data ended up being about this sort of jurisdictional question of, well, if you're interested in punishment, and the punishment scholars are thinking about state and nation. They're thinking about this sort of very large, jurisdictional, who has power. And the urban scholars are really thinking about, well, what's happening in this city. But I wanted to kind of merge those two intuitions and look at all cities across an entire state jurisdiction.
That's great. And that was enough time for a question to come up. So Becca Schwei asks, or says, you make a strong case that individual bias training alone won't move the needle. What are the policy interventions that can, I assume she means, affect this or move the needle?
Well, it's such a good question. In my book, what I do is I sort of conclude with a really sort of big challenge, which is the reform conversation, at least the ones that I've been very privy to, are really about, reducing recidivism, trying to get people to adhere to their post-release requirements, trying to keep people out of prison. And I think one of the challenges for me here is that, we could try to sort of throw services and support at these communities that have been affected, or we could punish them less. And I think what that takes, though, is a real appetite for the kinds of conversations that were happening last summer around policing, which is, these really profound questions around what does public safety truly mean in a context where people feel that in many cases the police are not offering that, and that the prison system is so harmful that it doesn't actually solve this puzzle of harm. And so my wind up is just to say, I talk a lot about, the concept of reparative justice in these conditions where people were sentenced for decades for things that are now getting decriminalized for, or people who, are really harmed by harsh conditions of confinement. And part of reparative justice is cessation. To actually repair past harms, you have to promise, there's a promise of non-repetition. And so I'd love to see, a really robust engagement with an entirely new reimagining of the justice system in communities. And I think that we actually have a lot of really great options at our fingertips that come from the fields of social work and public health, that don't take sort of a punitive approach to marginality and violence. So I write about place conscious, sort of actually to Catherine's point. I think it would be problematic to just pick a specific neighborhood and try to solve problems there, because people experience place and space very differently, and also the jurisdictions are sort of cross-cutting and all over the place. And so we want to create policies that are sort of aware of how communities function and are local enough to be supportive without sort of narrowing down on just a single neighborhood. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah. We have another question from Michael Light, and Michael, if you want me to unmute you to ask this question, let me know, but I'll start it for you. Can you elaborate on your discussion of loss and community loss in the context of Sampson's idea of the incarceration ledger? That is, incarceration does impact crime, and crime is also a community loss. How should we think about incarceration in the aggregate?
Michael, this is a great question, and I'm having some like PTSD from my dissertation defense because Rob asked me this question. So I appreciate it very much, and the opportunity to answer it perhaps more clearly this time. So I totally completely believe that true violence that's experienced in a community is a loss. I don't think that sending whole groups of people to prison is a response to that violence, is a it responds to that harm. It's what we have, and for many people, who am I to take that away from victims and people who experience violence? That's not. I definitely. I write about this a little bit in this chapter on loss, that it's not for me to decide if this loss, this community loss, is wholly harmful, but the point is to sort of really try to capture what exactly is that loss, what does it actually look like, and does thinking about time and years start to articulate a different notion of the harms of incarceration, beyond just the people themselves who are going in. That loss can be experienced and reverberates across that person's life into their families, their communities, their neighborhoods, their workplaces. I think there's no way we can sidestep the problem of violence and have a real justice system. But I think there's sort of unprecedented evidence to suggest that the prison system has, not solved this problem for communities long term.
And I unmuted Michael in case you wanted to talk more, to have a discussion about it as opposed to just the question.
No, Thank you so much. Actually, Jessica and I are meeting at 2, so I will.
Okay. Continue to interrogate her.
Exactly. Round 2 will commence.
Great. Can't wait.
Wonderful. Any other questions that folks have? I'll give them a minute to type it in. Yes, I will. Not seeing any other questions. I just want to thank you so much for your time. Oh, here we go. Catherine Curtis asks, in thinking about your response to the questions regarding loss, what share are violent crimes of all the incarceration, right? Because I was thinking the same thing, Catherine, right? Like people end up in jail for, or incarcerated for lots of reasons, and it's not always violent.
Yeah, I would say the breakdown is something like between 30 and 40% are anything from I went to school with a firearm in my backpack to homicide. So violence is, you know, coded as a very broad terminology. I really thought very deeply about, sorry, I just lost my train of thought because I saw another question. Sorry, violence, drug arrests.
Broad categories of what's considered violent.
This question of like, you know, why are people being, what causes people to go to prison or jail? You know, we, in so much of my data, whether I've studied policing and arrest records during the pandemic, to solitary confinement and why people end up in solitary, to this prison, it's a very small portion. It doesn't mean that it's not important or it's not, you know, like, you know, but there's a question there to me about what are your normative commitments, right? Like, should the prison system exist like a sort of a crime warranted sort of normative commitment? You know, in some cases, a parsimonious and small and just prison system should exist. Or are you of the opinion that the whole system at its core, you know, the roots are rotten and something has to change, you know, to kind of deal with the historic injustice of it? And I think, you know, sort of that's how, you know, and also why people end up in prison. It's such a, the actual data itself is hardly reflective of like the true lived experience of violence, where like somebody might be caught up in a lot of conditions of violence, but get caught for something else. And so, yeah, does what the prosecutor ends up, you know, charging this person with end up, you know, really reflecting the exposure of violence in a community? Like it's hard to know how those data in particular do that.
And Michael offered that 55% of state prisoners are there for violent crimes. We have another question, which is more of a data question. So how are incarcerated people's addresses collected? Are they self-reported? Is there any bias? How much missing data? I'll throw in also out of curiosity, like how good are these data?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. I have thought about this a ton, and I could go into great detail, and I also talk to the students about this quite a bit, but specifically the address is self-reported by the individual who comes into prison intake. So they remove their property, they are searched, they're asked a whole battery of questions, and one of the questions is, what was your last address? And so they report that. And in 2009, which is why a lot of my data sort of is inflected by that year, the prison system really started to collect that data for some reporting purposes for their parole system. And so the data quality is really high, and they will put in like a homeless shelter's name if that's where somebody lived, said that that's where they were living, and so I can geocode that. About 2% of the addresses were either missing or erroneous. And so that's how much data was not included. And of course, that could be, there's so much potential selection there, like they didn't have an address, they, you know, and also, you know, for my work on the other side, reentry, we know that people move around a lot. So it is an imperfect measure of geography. But it's what I was able to collect. Yeah.
Mara Curtis has a question. It seems to me there's a large disconnect between this community lens versus the individual metrics DOJs use upon release. In the reentry phase, risk scores are used to understand believed likelihood of reoffending and have implications for discharge planning and where and who can live with when under supervision. The rotten roots, as you say, are baked in all along the process. Upon release, then, can impact where one can go and likely how much non-specific overall surveillance conditions, daily life for those post-incarceration. I don't think that was a question. I believe that was a comment.
But I just, to follow up on that, I mean, it's a really very, powerful statement because, a risk score is fundamentally incorporating cumulative disadvantage, like all of the different steps that got to that risk score, it's a, and I guess I'd like to say that, maybe communities or, there's a risk score to how much a particular police precinct is, arresting people for things like I told the students today, I coded annoying was one of the reasons for arrest in my data. And this was in 2020. And so, there's a lot going on here that is pretty unnecessary. And that's a risk. Living in a very highly policed, high incarceration area has been shown to affect birth outcomes, including preterm birth, has been associated with mortality, has been associated with mental illness. So we could look at risk. We could look at risk in a lot of different ways.
I have one final question myself, at least, unless anyone else types in another one. As you know, Wisconsin looks bad on most of these types of metrics. And I'm just, so I'm not asking about why Wisconsin looks bad, but I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about when you move from local to sort of state, what you think is driving differences across states.
Oh, that's a big question. There is some scholars say, there are 50 different mass incarceration stories, and then you could see a lot of regional similarities. Racial disparities are really high in Northeastern and Midwestern states, and they're less high in Western and Southern states, but the rates are astronomically high in the South and the West. And they're, Midwest is kind of in the middle, and then the Northeast is the lowest. And a lot of historians look to the history of the states. A lot of them look to the history of how these policies unfold, the degree to which populations live in urban versus rural communities, sort of like the history of the Great Migration has been studied as a potential driver of later mass incarceration in the Northeast and Midwest. So there's a lot of sort of big sort of macro historical accounting for why there's so much variation, even between Wisconsin and Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, I think we're done with questions. I just want to say thank you so much. We've really enjoyed your talk, and we look forward to connecting at some point again, years down the road, when we're not virtual, when we can actually have you out to Wisconsin.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for your questions and comments. They were really helpful.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.